The wind on the high prairie was a constant, keening presence, a mourner that never ceased its lament. It whipped Hannah's skirt around her ankles as she walked the familiar path down to the creek, the wooden buckets heavy in her hands. Back in the winter of 1883, the land itself seemed to hold its breath, a vast, indifferent white canvas stretching to the bruised horizon. Their cabin, a stubborn box of logs huddled against a low rise, felt like the only mark humanity had managed to score upon its immensity. Hannah lived with her parents on this edge of the world, a world defined by backbreaking work, scant resources, and the ever-present tension of living on land claimed by others. The Navajo had been here first for generations beyond counting, and the uneasy truce with the distant reservation settlements felt thin as creek ice in April. Her parents, like most of the scattering of settlers nearby, carried a deep, wary suspicion of the native peoples. Stories, often exaggerated or born of fear, circulated like wildfire, of raids, of vanished travelers, of a fundamental, irreconcilable difference between their ways and theirs. Hannah had grown up steeped in this apprehension, a quiet girl who found solace in the vast sky and the endless, rolling land, yet felt the weight of her parents' fear like a second skin. Their life was a cycle of chores, sunrise to sunset, planting a meager garden, tending a few chickens, mending fences, hauling water, always hauling water. It was a monotonous existence, broken only by the infrequent trips to the nearest collection of sod houses and log cabins that optimistically called itself a town, days away by wagon. Isolation was not just distance, it was a state of being. Hannah was isolated within her family's fear, isolated by the sheer emptiness of the landscape, isolated by a quiet nature that made her feel like a shadow even when someone was near. Grief had marked their home too, a silent, empty chair at the rough-hewn table where her younger brother should have sat. He'd been taken by the fever 2 springs past, leaving a stillness in Hannah that mirrored the quiet of the prairie in deep winter. She was 17, but felt 100, burdened by a sorrow too large for her frame, and a loneliness that stretched as wide as the horizon. Today, the wind seemed particularly sharp, biting at her cheeks. She reached the creek bed, where the water was shallow and fast-flowing, the banks dusted with a fresh layer of snow from the night before. She set one bucket down and knelt, scooping water with a smaller pot to fill it. That was when she saw the smear of red against the white, upstream near a thicket of brush. Her heart leaped, a sudden, hard flutter against her ribs. For a terrifying moment, she thought of predators, a wounded animal, maybe a wolf. But as she rose slowly, scanning the brush, she saw a shape slumped against a rock, a shape that was undeniably human. He was small, curled in on himself, his dark hair stark against the snow. His clothes were unfamiliar, made of soft hides and cloth she hadn't seen before, but she knew instantly who he was. A Navajo boy. And he was bleeding. He looked up as she stared, his eyes wide and dark with pain and fear, the same fear she had been taught to feel for his people. His face was smudged with dirt and streaks of blood, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. One hand clutched his thigh, where dark, wet blood stained the buckskin of his trousers and pooled slowly on the snow. It was a deep, ragged wound, likely from a bullet. Hannah stood frozen for a long moment, the cold wind whipping around her, the heavy buckets forgotten. Everything she had ever been told screamed at her to turn and run, to race back to the cabin and her parents' protection. This boy was the enemy, a potential threat, a symbol of everything they feared. But looking at him, seeing the sheer, raw vulnerability in his eyes, the fear mirroring her own, the pain contorting his young face, something else stirred within her. It was the echo of her brother's suffering, the human face of pain that transcended the boundaries her world had drawn. She took a hesitant step towards him. He flinched back, pressing himself harder against the rock, a low whimper escaping his lips. It wasn't a sound of aggression, but of pure animal fear. "Hey," she said softly, her voice shaky. She raised her hands slowly, palms open, to show she held no weapon. "Hey, I won't hurt you." He didn't understand her words, she knew, but perhaps he understood the gesture, the gentle tone. He watched her with the intensity of a cornered animal. His wound needed tending. He would bleed to death out here in the cold. She couldn't leave him, not like this. The thought was sudden, firm, pushing aside the fear and the ingrained prejudice. It was a stark, simple truth. He was hurt. He needed help. Dropping the buckets entirely, ignoring the splash of water onto the snow, Hannah knelt a few feet away. She reached for the edge of her worn wool skirt, tearing a strip off the hem. It wasn't much, but it was clean fabric. "I need to see," she murmured, gesturing towards his leg. Can I look?" He watched her, eyes darting from her face to the strip of cloth, to the wound. He hesitated, then with a pained groan, shifted slightly, revealing the injury more clearly. The bullet had torn through the flesh, leaving a jagged, seeping mess. It needed to be cleaned and bound. Carefully, she crawled closer. He didn't pull away, but his muscles were tense, ready to spring if she made a sudden move. She reached out a hand, her fingers trembling slightly, and gently touched the fabric to the wound. He cried out, a sharp sound of pain, and she flinched back immediately. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I have to clean it. It's the only way." She dipped the cloth into the creek water, shivering as the icy water soaked it through. Wringing it out slightly, she returned to him, moving slowly, deliberately. This time she spoke simple, soothing words, the kind she might use to a frightened animal or a small child. "It'll hurt," she said, her voice low. "But just for a minute, just for a minute." Applying the wet cloth was agonizingly slow. Each touch brought a fresh wave of pain to his face, a tightening of his body. He bit his lip, his breath hitching, but he didn't cry out again. He endured it with a quiet strength that surprised her. She worked as quickly and gently as she could, wiping away the blood, trying to see the extent of the damage. It was deep, but it didn't look like the bone was shattered. He needed proper care, but she could at least stop the bleeding for now. Once it was reasonably clean, she used the rest of the torn skirt hem to wrap the wound tightly, tying it off with trembling fingers. It wasn't sterile, it wasn't professional, but it was better than nothing. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, her hands cold and stained with his blood. She looked at him, and he looked back at her. The raw fear in his eyes had lessened slightly, replaced by exhaustion and a flicker of something else. Relief, perhaps. Maybe even a sliver of curiosity, or simply wonder that she hadn't hurt him further. "You need to get somewhere warm," she said, though she knew he couldn't understand. "And you need real help." She couldn't take him back to the cabin. Her parents would never allow it. They would see only danger, only the enemy, not the hurt child before her. They might even. She couldn't think about what they might do. Hiding him was the only option. But where? The woods were too cold, too exposed. She looked around desperately, her gaze falling on a small, overgrown gully a little further downstream, mostly hidden by a thicket of pines and some rocky outcrops. There was a small overhang there, maybe enough to offer some shelter from the wind and snow. It wasn't much, but it was better than where he was now. "Can you walk?" she asked, gesturing towards the gully. Just a little ways?" He tried to push himself up, but a gasp of pain escaped him, and he slumped back. Walking was clearly not an option, not on that leg. He couldn't even stand. Panic fluttered in her chest. She couldn't carry him. He was too heavy, and she wasn't strong enough, not over this terrain. What was she going to do? She had helped him, but now she was faced with the impossible task of keeping him alive and hidden. An hour later, chilled to the bone despite the physical exertion, Hannah finally managed to get the boy to the gully. It had been a slow, agonizing process of him dragging himself, pushing with his good leg and arms, while she supported his injured side, half carrying, half dragging him the short distance. He hadn't complained, only bitten his lip and endured, his face pale and drawn. They settled him under the overhang, out of the direct wind. It was cold, but drier than the creek bank. "Okay," she puffed, kneeling beside him, trying to catch her breath. "Okay, stay here. I'll bring something." She raced back to the creek bed, grabbed the half-filled buckets, and hurried up the path towards the cabin. She had to act normal, had to make sure her parents suspected nothing. The secret felt heavy and dangerous in her chest. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of nervous energy. She helped her mother with supper, her hands clumsy, her mind miles away in the cold gully. She answered questions distractedly, praying they wouldn't notice her torn skirt hem, the faint smudge of blood on her sleeve she'd tried to wipe away. She needed blankets, food, real bandages if she could find them. Getting them without arousing suspicion would be difficult. That night, under the pretense of going out to check on a noise she claimed she'd heard, Hannah slipped out of the cabin. The cold hit her like a physical blow. She carried a couple of her own worn blankets bundled under her arm, a tin cup, and a small leather pouch containing some jerky and a few hard biscuits she'd managed to pilfer from the larder. It wasn't much, but it was something. Finding the gully in the dark was harder than she expected, even with the faint moonlight reflecting off the snow. The wind seemed louder, more menacing. She reached the overhang, her heart pounding. "Hello?" she whispered into the darkness. Are you there?" A small sound, a rustle in the brush, and then his dark shape shifted in the gloom. He was still there, still alive. A wave of relief washed over her, so potent it made her knees weak. She knelt beside him. He was huddled against the rock, the makeshift bandage dark and damp. He shivered violently. "Here," she said, unfolding a blanket. "Take this, get warm." She carefully draped the blankets over him, tucking them around his shoulders. He pulled them tight immediately, burying his face in the wool. She could feel his shivers subside slightly. She offered him the cup. "Water," she said, "for drinking." He took it with a hesitant hand, his fingers brushing hers, a fleeting touch that felt strangely significant in the dark. He drank slowly, thirstily. She then offered the food. He took a piece of jerky, his eyes watching her in the faint light. They sat in silence for a long time. The wind howled outside their small, temporary shelter. Inside the gully, it was quieter, just the sound of their breathing and the occasional snap of branches in the wind. He didn't try to speak, and she didn't press him. His silence was a language she was beginning to understand, a language of pain, fear, and a deep wariness of the world. Her silence was one of fear, worry, and a growing, unexpected connection. In the days that followed, Hannah fell into a secret routine. Every morning she would go for water, lingering at the creek to check on him, bring fresh water and what little food she could spare or hide. Every evening after her parents were asleep, she would sneak out again with blankets, sometimes a piece of stale bread or a cold potato from supper. She cleaned his wound as best she could, using boiled water she carried in a sealed tin, and tried to keep it bandaged with strips of old sheeting she tore up. The wound was slow to heal. It festered initially, hot and angry, and she worried constantly about fever. She tried poultices she remembered her mother using, crushed wild herbs she found under the snow, anything she could think of. He endured it all with quiet stoicism, flinching at the pain but never resisting her care. He was young, maybe a year or two younger than her, she guessed. He had the lean frame of a boy still growing, but his eyes held an ancient weariness. Little by little, the initial terror between them began to dissipate. He still flinched if she moved too quickly, but he no longer recoiled from her touch when she was tending his wound. He would watch her with intense, dark eyes as she sat with him, sometimes for long stretches, simply keeping him company in the lonely gully. She would talk to him, telling him about her day, about the weather, about the birds she saw, simple things, not expecting him to understand, just filling the silence. It was easier than sitting in her own head, listening to the endless wind and the echoes of her grief. One afternoon, as she was changing his bandage, he reached out a tentative hand and touched her sleeve. She paused, looking at him. He pointed to the tear near the hem, then to her. He made a gesture like tearing cloth. "Oh," she said, a small smile touching her lips. "You mean my skirt? Yes, I used it for you. It's all right." He looked at the bandage, then back at her, a small nod acknowledging her meaning. It was the first real communication, a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. Another day she brought him a small, smooth stone she had found, streaked with veins of quartz. She gave it to him, just because it was pretty and the gully was so bare. He took it, turning it over in his fingers, then looked up at her and offered a faint, fleeting smile. It transformed his face, chasing away some of the shadows that usually clung there. Hannah felt something warm bloom in her chest, a feeling she hadn't felt in a long time. It was a fragile sprout of connection in the barren landscape of her life. She learned his name, or part of it, one evening. She pointed to herself. "Hannah," she said clearly. He looked at her, hesitated, then pointed to himself. "Dakota," he murmured, the sound soft and hesitant. His voice was quiet, unused. Dakota. The name felt important, a step across the divide. He was no longer just the Navajo boy, he was Dakota. Their bond deepened in the quiet secrecy of the gully. They shared the sparse food, shared the silence, shared the vulnerability of being hidden away from the world. He showed her small things, how to tie a certain knot, how to interpret the calls of distant birds. She showed him small things in return, the comfort of a warm drink, the quiet strength of her determination to keep him safe. His wound was slowly healing, a puckered scar forming over the torn flesh. He could move his leg better now, even put a little weight on it, though walking was still difficult and painful. But the outside world was beginning to press in. Talk in the cabin became more anxious. Her father mentioned seeing tracks near the creek, tracks he couldn't identify. Her mother fretted about savages in the area, repeating the old fearful stories with renewed intensity. Neighbors riding by mentioned recent incidents, a missing calf, smoke spotted in the distance. The unspoken fear in their small community was solidifying into suspicion, and suspicion was a dangerous thing on the frontier. One crisp morning Hannah was at the creek when she heard the distant sound of horses and men's voices. Her blood ran cold. It was too early for neighbors just passing. These sounded like men on a purpose. She ducked behind the thicket, her heart hammering against her ribs. 3 men on horseback rode slowly along the creek bed, scanning the banks, the brush, the gully. One of them, a burly man named Brody from a few miles over, dismounted near where she had first found Dakota. He knelt, examining the ground. "Tracks here, Cal," Brody called to the others. "Look like moccasins, and looks like blood." Cal, a lean man with a hard face, dismounted as well. "How fresh?" "Hard to say with the snow," Brody replied, "but it ain't completely drifted over. Could be recent, could be that varmint that took Henderson's calf." Hannah pressed herself further into the brush, barely breathing. They were close. Too close. They were looking, they were finding signs. She had to warn Dakota. The men moved on, following the creek downstream, but the danger was clear. They were searching, and if they found him, they wouldn't see a wounded boy. They would see a target. She waited until their voices faded, until the sound of their horses was gone. Then she ran. She ran back to the gully, her lungs burning in the cold air. "Dakota," she whispered urgently, sliding down the bank. He looked up, startled by her sudden appearance and the fear on her face. "They're looking," she said, her voice low and frantic. "Men. From the settlements. They found tracks by the creek, and blood." His eyes widened, fear flooding his face again. He understood enough. The look in his eyes was confirmation. He knew what it meant to be found by men like that. "You have to hide better," she urged. "They were close to the gully. Maybe they'll come back." He nodded, pushing himself up slowly, wincing as his leg protested. Where could he go? The overhang was a decent shelter, but not a hiding place if someone was actively searching. Is there anywhere else?" she asked, gesturing around the small gully. He scanned the area, his gaze resting on a narrow fissure in the rock face behind the overhang, mostly obscured by brush. It looked too small for a person. He hobbled towards it, pushing aside some branches. It was less a cave and more a deep crack in the stone. He peered into it, then looked back at her, a silent question in his eyes. It was tight, uncomfortable, but it was hidden. "Yes," she nodded, a surge of determination replacing the fear. "Yes, that's better, they won't see it." Helping him get into the fissure was difficult and painful. He had to slide in sideways, his injured leg protesting with every movement. Once he was inside, he was completely out of sight, hidden by the brush and the narrowness of the opening. She arranged branches and snow around the entrance to make it look undisturbed. "Stay there," she whispered. "Don't make a sound. I'll come back when it's safe." She returned to the cabin, her mind racing. The searchers were still out there. She heard her father talking about them later that day. They were organizing, planning a wider search of the area. The fear in the settlement was turning into a call for action, for retribution. The next day was tense. Hannah helped with chores, her ears straining for sounds of horses. She knew the men would likely check their property, ask questions. She felt a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Late in the afternoon, the sound she had been dreading reached them. Horses, closer this time, and the rumble of men's voices. Her father went out to meet them, his face tight with apprehension. Her mother stood in the cabin doorway, wringing her hands. Hannah stayed inside, near the small, smoky fireplace, trying to appear calm. Brody and Cal were among the men. There were 5 of them in total, armed and serious. "Afternoon, Thomas," Brody said to her father. "Heard you saw some sign down by the creek?" Her father nodded. "Saw some tracks yesterday morning. Didn't look like deer. Showed 'em to Marshal Higgins. He said they might be—" He trailed off, glancing towards the cabin. "Indian tracks?" Cal finished bluntly. "We're searching the area. Any sign around here? Anything out of the ordinary?" Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. They were asking directly. Her father hesitated. He was a cautious man, not one for trouble. He feared the native people, but he also disliked the aggressive posturing of men like Cal and Brody. "No," her father said slowly. "Nothing else. Just those tracks down by the water. Haven't seen hide nor hair of anyone since." "Anyone come around?" Cal pressed, his eyes narrowed. "See any strangers?" "No, just us. Hannah here goes down for water daily. She'd have seen something." Her father gestured towards the cabin. All eyes turned to Hannah. Cal's gaze felt like a physical weight. He looked at her, a young woman, quiet, seemingly harmless. "That right, girl?" Cal asked. His voice was flat, challenging. "You seen anything strange down by the creek? Anyone been around?" Hannah swallowed, her mouth dry. Her mother was watching her, her eyes wide with fear, silently begging her to say nothing, to deny everything, to keep them safe. The memory of Takota's scared face, his vulnerability, flashed in her mind. She met Cal's hard gaze, drew a breath, and spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "No, sir," she said, trying to keep any tremor from her tone. "Just the tracks my pa showed you. Nothing else. The creek's frozen over in most places now, just open where it's fast. Hard to get down there anyway." It wasn't a lie, not exactly. She hadn't seen anyone else down there. And the creek was mostly frozen. She focused on small truths, weaving them into a larger deception. Cal held her gaze for another moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he seemed to accept her statement. She was just a girl, after all, a settler's daughter. What would she know? What threat could she pose? "All right," Cal said finally, turning back to her father. "We'll continue our search. You see anything at all, you ride for town, you understand?" "Yes, Cal, I understand," her father replied. The men remounted their horses. Brody lingered for a moment, glancing towards the creek again, a thoughtful frown on his face. Then he too rode off with the others. Hannah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her knees felt weak, and she leaned against the doorframe for support. Her mother came over, putting a trembling hand on her arm. "Thank heavens," her mother whispered. "You said the right thing." Hannah didn't respond. She felt a strange mix of relief and defiance. She had lied to her parents, to their neighbors, to the men who represented the law and order of their world. She had lied to protect a wounded boy, an enemy. The weight of the lie was heavy, but less heavy than the thought of what would have happened if she had told the truth. She waited until dark, until the cabin was quiet and her parents were asleep. Then, bundled against the cold, she slipped out again, carrying the meager supplies she had managed to gather. She reached the gully, her heart still pounding from the earlier confrontation. "Takota," she whispered into the darkness. "Takota, are you there?" Silence. Panic flared. Had they found him? Had they seen the fisher? "Takota," she said, a little louder this time, a tremor in her voice. A low groan, barely audible, came from the narrow crack in the rock. He was still there. "Oh, thank goodness," she breathed, rushing to the fisher. "Are you all right?" He eased himself out slowly, stiff and shivering from the cold and the cramped space. His face was pale in the moonlight. He looked utterly exhausted. "They came," she told him softly, kneeling beside him. "They were searching. They found the blood." He nodded, his eyes dark with understanding. I told them I hadn't seen anything," she confessed, the words feeling strange and liberating at the same time. "I lied for you." He looked at her then, truly looked at her. In his eyes, she saw not just fear and pain, but a dawning comprehension, a deepening of the trust that had begun to form between them. He reached out a hand, very slowly, and placed it gently on her arm. He didn't say anything, but the gesture spoke volumes. It was gratitude, acknowledgement, a silent thank you that meant more than any words could have. They sat together under the overhang, the wind still whipping through the gully, but the small space felt like a sanctuary. The danger hadn't passed entirely, but for now, they were safe. The events of the day had forged their connection stronger, a secret shared, a loyalty chosen against the expectations of their separate worlds. She had defied the fear and prejudice of her community for him. He had placed his complete trust in her, a member of the people who had wounded him. The bloody divide didn't matter here, in the quiet of the gully. Only the shared humanity, the unexpected kindness, the fragile tendril of connection mattered. Over the next week, the search continued sporadically, but less intensely. The men moved on to other areas, other rumored sightings. The immediate danger receded, but the underlying threat remained. Dakota's wound continued to heal, slowly but steadily. He could walk with less pain now, could move with more ease. The time had come to think about what came next. "You need to go home," Hannah said to him one afternoon, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. "To your people." He watched her, his expression unreadable. He hadn't spoken much since saying his name, his voice still quiet and perhaps unused to English, or maybe unused to speaking aloud at all. "It's not safe for you here," she continued, "and your family, they must be worried." He looked away, towards the mountains in the distance, his home. A shadow crossed his face. He missed them. Of course, he missed them. "Do you know the way?" she asked. He nodded. "Can you travel?" He flexed his injured leg, testing it. He hesitated, then nodded again, more confidently this time. He was strong, resilient. He had survived a bullet wound, exposure, and days hidden in the cold. The thought of him leaving brought a surprising ache to Hannah's chest. As much as she worried for his safety, his presence, however silent and demanding, had filled a void in her life she hadn't fully acknowledged until now. He was her secret, her purpose, her connection in a world that felt otherwise empty. But she knew it was the right thing to do, for him, for his family, for her own safety, though that felt secondary now. She couldn't keep him hidden forever, and the longer he stayed, the greater the risk to them both. They spent the next few days preparing. Hannah gathered what supplies she could, risking small thefts from her own pantry, extra jerky, dried beans, a precious tin of crackers. She found an old, sturdy walking stick for him to use. She patched his buckskin trousers as best she could. The morning he was to leave, the air was crisp and cold, the sky, a pale, unforgiving blue. They walked down to the creek together, him leaning heavily on the stick, her carrying the small bundle of supplies. The gully felt empty already, its secret gone. They stopped at the creek bed, the same spot where she had first found him. The snow had melted in places, revealing the wet earth beneath. Hannah held out the bundle of food and the walking stick. He took them, his eyes fixed on hers. There was no fear in them now, only a quiet depth of understanding. "Be careful, Dakota," she said softly. "Go straight home, don't let anyone see you." He nodded. He reached into his deerskin shirt and pulled something out. It was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, smooth with age, strung on a thin leather thong. It was a simple thing, but clearly precious. He held it out to her. Hannah hesitated, looking at the bird, then at his face. It was a gift, a token of thanks, a piece of his world offered to hers. "I can't," she began, shaking her head. "It's yours." He pressed it into her hand, closing her fingers gently around it. He shook his head slowly, insisting. His eyes conveyed the message. "Keep it. Remember." Tears pricked Hannah's eyes. This small, carved bird, given by a boy from a world she had been taught to fear, felt like the most valuable thing she had ever received. It was proof that kindness could bloom in the harshest ground, that connection could bridge the deepest divides. "Thank you, Dakota," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." He offered her that rare, quiet smile again. Then, he turned and began to move upstream along the creek bed, favoring his good leg, leaning on the stick. He didn't look back. Hannah watched him go until he was a small, solitary figure against the vast landscape, then disappeared into the brush. She stood there for a long time, the cold wind biting at her cheeks, the wooden bird clutched tightly in her hand. Her life would go back to its routine, the chores, the isolation, the quiet cabin. But it would not be the same. A secret lay buried in the gully, a bond forged in fear and sealed with kindness. She carried the weight of the lie she had told, but also the lightness of a heart that had opened, had chosen compassion over prejudice, connection over isolation. The carved bird in her hand was a tangible reminder of the boy who had stumbled wounded into her life, a representative of the other who had become simply Dakota, a human being who needed help. It was a reminder of her own strength, her own capacity for courage she hadn't known she possessed. She had faced the ingrained fears of her world and chosen a different path, a path paved with quiet acts of defiance and unexpected grace. The bloody divide between their peoples was vast and real, built on generations of conflict and misunderstanding. But here, in the quiet heart of the prairie, one small act of kindness had bridged it, leaving a scar that was not of violence but of healing and hope. Hannah turned, the wind still a mourner's lament, but in her heart, a quiet, resilient strength had taken root. She walked back towards the cabin, the path no longer just a route for chores, but a symbol of the journey her own heart had taken, a journey from fear to courage, from isolation to a profound, if temporary, connection that had changed her forever.